Hi guys, and welcome back to History Revision Success. Now in today's video, what we're going to do is give you some really specific examples for your how effective was Nazi economic policy, thematic topic and essays, really specific examples in terms of what the Nazis changed in different elements of the economy in order to make progress. Okay, so in my previous video, I've given you overviews of the period of time we call recovery and the period of time we call rearmament, and kind of government-centric policy and aims and methods and things like that. Now, here is going to be that really intricate detail about, more ordinary people and what they did in terms of agriculture, what they did in terms of industry, and things like that. Okay, so much more really specific stuff that you can put into your essays to show really, really high quality A-star knowledge. Now, I'm going to start by talking about agriculture. So, the government was concerned with larger, more efficient estates whose production of food was vital for autarky and war. So remember, under rearmament, they had the aim of achieving economic autarky, which is where you are completely self-sufficient. So because of that, agriculture becomes very, very important to the Nazi kind of economic policy. Now, the government also wanted to avoid high food prices, as this would threaten wage stability. Therefore, everyone involved in agriculture had to join the Reich Food Estate, which regulated production, distribution, if I can speak properly, imports, wages, and prices. And in May of 1933, the Reich entailed farm law was designed to protect smaller farms, which were around 35% of all farms in Germany. Now, this meant that these farms could not be sold or mortgaged and had to be passed from person to person. Now, in reality, what this did was tie much of the peasantry to the land and actually discouraged innovation. These peasants found it very difficult to get new loans as they could not use their farm as security. And in reality, it didn't really help farmers prosper. Protection and the control of prices that initially helped farmers later served to keep prices below market levels and were increasingly resented. Arable farmers benefited from subsidies, but livestock farmers were hit by shortages and the high cost of fodder, which is what they feed the cows and things like that. Now, farms were increasingly harmed by migration to the cities, and extra labour had to be drafted in. Rural populations fell from around 21% in 1933 to 18% of the population by 1939. And in 1939, 435,000 people were brought in as foreign labour. Land values rose, but production failed to meet growing demand. The shortfall was made up from conquered territories once war began. So, in summary, positives. Well, from 1928 to 1938, production is up 20%, and the 4-year plan had helped with reduced fertilizer prices, subsidies for mechanization, and grants of new cultivated land. However, on the other hand, in the negatives, there was limited agricultural growth because of labor shortages. A lack of capital for investment meant limited mechanization, and the priority was for the military, not for agricultural machinery. Now, even more so, we can think about the fact that Hitler's Reich entailed farm law has quite literally taken away a lot of individual freedom from a lot of these small farmers, most of who would be in kind of the middle stand, so the middle classes. So they definitely have not benefited from these laws. Now, the next section I'm going to go over is transport. So there was a great Nazi effort into a massive autobahn creation scheme that symbolized the new Germany. It was used in propaganda to kind of symbolize this new, moment of economic prosperity. The roads were built by the Supreme Reich Authority under Todt, and 2,000 miles were built by 1938, which boosted employment and stimulated car production. It also emphasized German prestige. Railways, on the other hand, were neglected and were under increasing pressures because they had to supply factories, transportation of troops, and also the later transportation of Jews. Now, if we look at foreign trade as a third section, there is no real major growth in foreign trade during the 1930s, and less importance is given to external trade. What they do that we know is over time they continually take over more and more land with which to use the resources of. And here is a map behind me of the progress that the Nazi state make in terms of taking over land across Central Europe. Industry, okay, so one of the bigger topics. So industry is brought under state supervision, and all firms were members of the Reichsgruppe for Industry. Industry remained largely privately owned while the state controlled most of the resources. So who are these men who kind of privately owned and had much of a say in industry? So many of Germany's business leaders welcomed the Nazi takeover of power in 1933. Some, such as Fritz Thyssen, who I've got on the board behind me, and Alfred Hugenberg, had helped Hitler in his bid to take power, and Hitler had reassured leaders like this that the more socialist elements of the Nazi Party program should not alarm them. In the early months, many policies were of benefit to business, the suppression of trade unions, the establishment of political stability, and the revival of the economy helped to create an environment favourable to business. However, there were many who did not like this greater state intervention, and Fritz Thyssen, for example, an iron baron, actually fled to Switzerland, claiming soon Germany will be no different from Bolshevik Russia. The regime was able to enlist the cooperation and expertise of big businesses and management in the implementation of economic policy. With the 4-year plan, many were able to make profits through involvement in rearmament. So you could win big contracts from the state and you could make these, huge numbers of tanks or guns or whatever it might be. And that was very profitable for the business. For example, Daimler-Benz gained greatly with aeroplane factories paid for by the state. Between 1932 and 1941, production rose over 800%. Another significant benefactor was IG Farben, which is behind me and probably one of the most famous of the factories from Nazi Germany. They were heavily involved in the production of synthetic materials, and as historian Haydn stated, profits went above all to the industries who were prepared to collaborate actively with the regime. Now, profits from IG Farben increased from 71 million to 240 million Reichsmarks. It benefited from over 50% of the government investments, and by 1943 owned 334 plants. However, many were also skeptical, and many companies of the Ruhr iron and steel firms were reluctant to invest in new steelworks to produce steel from kind of poor quality and expensive German iron ore. So with this idea of being self-sufficient and following, economic autarky, Germany were pushing to use kind of low quality German steel rather than importing higher quality foreign steel, which would previously have been used. And what they did was they kind of forced these other companies to privately invest into this, even if they didn't want to. Even IG Farben felt the war was unwelcome at this point and disliked the fact it was compelled to move into these eastern territories. Now, the regime solved all of this by bypassing these private companies altogether, and they established the Hermann Goering Steelworks. Now, this was an enormous enterprise established and owned by the state, but partly financed by private companies who had been forced to invest in it. Private companies invested 130 million of the 400 million mark project, so almost over a quarter. Any who resisted were threatened by Goering with sabotage, and the company was given priority over all others in terms of the allocation of materials and labour. By 1939, it had become one of the largest enterprises in all of Europe. It expanded its operations into coal mining and the manufacture of heavy machinery. As Germany expanded its territory, the Hermann Goering Steelworks also expanded into Austria, Poland, and France. Now, both the steelworks and IG Farben were both very famous for using kind of slave labor from the Nazi concentration camps, and IG Farben actually produced the gas that was used in the extermination camps. Half its labor force were from the concentration camps themselves, showing the extent to which business had become impregnated with Nazi values. So there's a summary of kind of all the elements of Nazi economy and where changes actually occurred in those individual industries and sectors. Now, my last video for the moment on this is going to be on the impact on living standards for ordinary people. So go and check that out so you can use that as an evaluation to evaluate the effectiveness of this economic policy as in comparison to kind of, did it actually make life better for people living in Germany?